Thank you, Mr. President. There's some interesting irony of you being at the podium on this particular bill. So, yes, I have an amendment. First, I'm going to share what I'm not going to talk about. I'm not going to talk about the fact that we're about ready to vote on some things that are precedent-setting and very dangerous, things that we don't have any clue what the unintended consequences are, things that create real, very real discriminatory conditions and infringements of rights, like if you happen to be the wrong age when you're unfortunately abused, or if you happen to have that abuse on December 31st versus January 1st of a given year, or if you didn't quite get your plea in 12 months, and it's 12 months and 1 day, you're out of luck. I'm not going to talk about that stuff. Nor am I going to talk about bills that add to the list of mandatory reporters. On the surface, that sounds reasonable. But some of my colleagues are tired of hearing me saying this. Just because you can doesn't mean you should, and just because it might feel good doesn't mean it is good. Continuing to add mandatory reporting to things like this presumes that government knows what somebody sees and presumes that government knows what somebody thinks. And that is another very dangerous precedent. And then lastly, I'm not going to talk about increasing the fees for such. There's no evidence that suggests that increasing fees for these kinds of things changes anybody's behavior. I don't know a single person in the world that would choose to do or not report based on what they thought their fees were going to be. It's absurd. But what I am going to talk about, Mr. President, is an amendment that I'd like to offer on this bill. Since I believe this entire Senate is rifle shot, I should say, I hope this entire Senate is rifle shot focused on maximizing the amount of justice to the victims. Despite the fact that I've already made my case that we're very discriminatory about who can qualify for such, because this is so precedent-setting, because it is so unusual, because the cases are so egregious, I think it should cause all of us to think about how else can we ensure that the victims receive the maximum amount of justice. So my amendment would put a sliding scale on contingency fees, limit the total amount on a given case to $1 million. And that's about as simple as it gets. There's been arguments opposing this, saying that, oh my goodness, if we alter the contingency fee for these cases only, attorneys may not receive their full compensation for their expenses. Well, Mr. President, I have news for you. When any attorney takes a case on contingency, the entire amount of their expenses are at risk. So it's an absurd argument. Another argument is that this will somehow infringe with due process, because attorneys will decide, because there's been a very special case made for contingency fees on these very special cases that is precedent-setting, that maybe we won't take this case, but for a marginally smaller contingency fee. I find that equally absurd, and frankly, if an attorney were to conclude that, there'd be undeniable evidence that we really know what really matters to these attorneys. This is not about being punitive to trial attorneys. This is about if we're going to go this far and make these kind of changes that I think are undefined, dangerous, and extremely precedent-setting, that to me this is the least we can do if we're going to go this far, is to make sure we're doing our best to deliver all the justice we can. So, Mr. President, I'd like this body to consider this amendment, and I appreciate the opportunity to make my case.